Picture this, a sleek Viking longship slicing through the frigid North Atlantic waves. Its dragon-headed prow cutting through the mist like a blade. For centuries, we've been told these were the ships of fearsome raiders, of warriors descending upon coastal villages with axe and fire. But what if I told you that story is only half true? What if these very ships carried not just warriors, but wool, amber, and silver? What if the real Viking legacy wasn't written in blood, but in trade routes so vast they connected continents? We often imagine Vikings as the horn-helmeted barbarians of popular legend. But beneath that myth lies a far more fascinating truth. These were the master merchants of the medieval world, the architects of a commercial network that stretched from the frozen shores of Newfoundland all the way to the bustling markets of Baghdad. While kings and emperors ruled their little corners of the map, the Vikings were weaving them together with threads of commerce, culture, and curiosity. They didn't just raid monasteries, they supplied them with goods from places most Europeans didn't even know existed. This is the story we're unraveling today, a journey into the heart of Viking trade, a hidden world of economic genius that forever altered the course of history. We're going to explore how fur from Scandinavia ended up warming caliphs in the desert, how silver from Afghanistan found its way into Norse hoards, and how these seafaring entrepreneurs built an empire of exchange that laid the groundwork for the globalized world we live in today. So settle in, because we're about to set sail on a voyage of discovery, one that will change the way you see the Vikings, and perhaps the very nature of history itself. To truly understand the Viking trader, we must first dismantle the caricature. The horned helmet is a modern invention, a fantasy that obscures a far more complex reality. The truth is, the line between Viking raider and Viking merchant was incredibly thin, often non-existent. Think of it not as two separate jobs, but two sides of the same coin. A farmer from Norway might join a summer expedition not knowing if he would return with plunder from a monastery or profit from a market. His identity was fluid, shaped by opportunity. A successful raid provided the capital to become a merchant, and a successful trade voyage could fund the next raid. This wasn't a contradiction to them. It was simply good business. We find the most compelling proof of this mercantile mindset not in sagas, but in the silent earth of their graves. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of burial sites across the Norse world, containing not just swords and shields, but the essential tools of commerce, finely crafted scales and sets of meticulously standardized weights. These weren't crude measurements. The weights were part of an internationally recognized system, often folding brass weights from the Islamic world, or lead weights wrapped in shining silver foil to denote their value and integrity. To be buried with these items was a statement. It signified that this person's status, their very honor, was tied to their ability to conduct fair and precise trade. A warrior was trusted to wield a sword, but a trader was trusted to wield the scales. And in Viking society, that trust was a cornerstone of their identity. This dual nature allowed them to operate with a unique flexibility that more established empires couldn't match. When they arrived on a foreign shore, their approach was pragmatic. If a coastal town was well defended, they would set up a market and trade their goods. If it appeared vulnerable, the very same men might switch tactics. This adaptability was their greatest strength. It meant they could penetrate regions not by force alone, but by establishing networks of exchange, building relationships, and learning what commodities were desired where. They became the indispensable middlemen of the early medieval period, connecting producers and consumers across vast distances who would otherwise never have met. The Viking trader wasn't just a merchant. He was an explorer, a diplomat, and occasionally a predator, all rolled into one. His ship was his office, and the open sea was his highway. But to move goods on such an unimaginable scale, from Arctic furs to Arabian silver, required more than just mercantile ambition. It demanded a vessel of unparalleled capability, a floating masterpiece of medieval engineering. While the iconic longship, the Drakkar, was the swift predator of the seas, built for speed and raiding, the true backbone of the Viking economy was its humble, robust cousin, the Knarr. If the longship was the sports car, all sleek lines and terrifying speed, the Knarr was the 18-wheeler, the dependable and capacious workhorse that made their global trade network physically possible. Its design was a triumph of form meeting function. Unlike the long and narrow longship, the Knarr featured a broader, deeper hull, a floating warehouse built for capacity, not combat. Imagine a hull so stout it could carry up to 24 tons of cargo. That's the equivalent of a dozen dairy cows, bales of wool and furs, tons of amber, and countless tusks from walruses, all securely stored amidships. This immense space was protected from the punishing North Atlantic waves by a fully decked-over cargo hold, a critical feature that kept precious trade goods dry and secure during weeks-long open ocean voyages. Perhaps its most ingenious feature, however, was its shallow draft. This is the secret weapon that truly set Viking trade apart. The Knarr was an amphibious vehicle of its day. Its design allowed it to cross the treacherous depths of the North Atlantic. But then, upon reaching a foreign coast, it could do something no other contemporary merchant ship could. It could sail directly up shallow rivers, deep into the heart of a continent. A Knarr could depart from a fjord in Norway, cross the sea, and then navigate the network of rivers leading deep into Russia, or sail up the Seine to threaten Paris, or even traverse the relatively shallow waters around the British Isles. This meant Vikings didn't need to establish large, fortified ports. They could pull their ship onto any reasonably flat beach, establishing a temporary market right at the water's edge, trading directly with local populations before moving on. This mobility made them incredibly agile and difficult to pin down, both as merchants and as raiders. The single square sail, massive and woven from rough wool, provided the primary power for these epic journeys, but the Knarr also retained a small side of oar. These weren't for battle, but for precise maneuvering, rowing through narrow, winding river systems, navigating tricky currents, or making painstaking progress during the dreaded calms when the wind died completely. This combination of sail and oar gave the Knarr a versatility that was unmatched. We can see this engineering legacy in the archaeological record, particularly in the famous Skulderlev wrecks found in Denmark, where a beautifully preserved Knarr reveals every detail of its construction, from the overlapping planks riveted together with iron nails to the sturdy keel that gave it stability in rough weather. It was this vessel, more than any sword or axe, that was the ultimate symbol of Viking power, their ability to go anywhere, carry anything, and connect the world. Now, with these incredible ships as their engines of commerce, the Vikings were poised to launch themselves onto the global stage. But to understand the sheer scale and sophistication of their trade, we need to follow the money. And in the Viking Age, that meant following the silver. Not the silver from European mines, but a seemingly endless river of Islamic silver coins called dirhams, flowing north from the bustling markets of Baghdad and Samarkand. This torrent of wealth didn't magically appear in Scandinavia. It was earned through one of the most ambitious and perilous trade routes in history, the journey down the Volga River. This eastern route was the economic superhighway of its day, a liquid road that connected the Baltic Sea to the Caspian. and beyond that, to the fabulously wealthy Abbasid Caliphate. Viking traders, whom the locals called the Rus, a name that would eventually give its title to Russia, itself did not conquer this route with armies, but with market stalls. They established key trading posts at strategic points along the river, most notably at Staraya Ladoga, and later at the great city of Novgorod. From these hubs, they launched their Knarrs and smaller boats south, embarking on a voyage that could take an entire season. The primary commodity the Islamic world desired was not gold or jewels, but people. The Vikings were major players in the grim slave trade, capturing or purchasing Slavs from the interior and transporting them to the ports of the Caspian Sea. There, they were sold to Persian and Arab merchants, a transaction that generated immense profits. But human cargo was just one part of a much larger and more diverse portfolio of northern goods. The caliphs and their courts had an insatiable appetite for luxury items that only the far north could provide. Think of Arctic fox and beaver furs, so much warmer and finer than anything available locally, becoming status symbols in the desert heat. Walrus ivory, known as fish teeth, was highly prized for carving intricate objects, a crucial material before the widespread use of elephant ivory. And amber, that fossilized golden resin from the Baltic coast, was believed to hold mystical properties and was fashioned into beautiful beads and ornaments. In exchange for these northern treasures, the Vikings received payment almost exclusively in silver dirhams. Millions upon millions of these coins, minted from silver mined as far away as Afghanistan, made the long journey back up the Volga to Scandinavia. The evidence for this trade is not just historical, it's buried in the soil. All across Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of silver hoards. Farmers ploughing their fields still today can strike a piece of history. A clump of dirt-encrusted coins that last saw the light of day over 1,000 years ago. These weren't neat coin collections, they were raw capital. Vikings often stored their wealth by hacking the coins into pieces, using their finely calibrated scales to weigh out the exact amount of silver needed for a transaction. This was a weight-based economy, and the sheer volume of silver reshaped Scandinavian society, fueling the rise of powerful chieftains and funding the construction of those iconic ships that would continue to expand their reach. This riverine journey was far more than a simple exchange of goods. It was a meeting of worlds. The Vikings on the Volga were not just traders, they were intermediaries, a cultural and economic bridge between the pagan north and the Islamic south. They facilitated one of the largest transfers of wealth the early medieval world had ever seen, a testament to their entrepreneurial spirit and their unparalleled ability to connect the most disparate corners of the globe. Yet for all the wealth flowing from the east, another destination captured the Viking imagination like no other, a city of such staggering wealth and splendor that Norse skalds called it Miklagard, the Great City. To reach it, however, required a journey far more perilous than the Volga trade run. This was the Dnieper River route, a southern artery that demanded not just mercantile skill, but raw courage and sheer force of will. The voyage began in the trading hubs of the north, like Kiev, which the Rus Vikings had established as their own powerful principality. From there, a flotilla of Knarrs would cast off, their holds packed with the same northern luxuries desired in the Islamic world: furs, honey, wax, and most tragically, slaves. The early part of the journey was deceptively calm, a peaceful float south through forested lands, but this serenity was a trap. The real challenge lay ahead in a series of terrifying rapids that choked the lower Dnieper River. The Byzantines knew these stretches well, chronicling them with names that send a chill down the spine. The Norse traders, relying on guides and their own hard-won experience, faced a terrifying ritual. At each major rapid, they had no choice but to unload their entire cargo onto the riverbank. Then, using ropes and sheer muscle, they would physically guide their empty, precious vessels through the roaring, rock-strewn whitewater. A back-breaking, dangerous task where one slip could mean the loss of a ship and its entire fortune. Once the ship was safely through, they would porter all the goods along the bank, reload, and sail on to the next set of rapids, repeating the grueling process again and again. This was a logistical nightmare, a test of endurance that separated the successful merchant from the foolhardy. But the river itself was only half the danger. The banks were controlled by hostile nomadic tribes, most notably the Pechenegs. These expert horsemen watched the Viking flotillas from the high bluffs, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They knew the traders were at their most vulnerable during the portage around the rapids, when men were exhausted, cargo was exposed on the riverbank, and ships were empty and unstable in the water. A coordinated attack could wipe out an entire trade expedition, claiming ships, goods, and lives. This constant threat meant Viking traders on the Dnieper had to be warriors too, standing guard with axe and shield while their comrades worked, turning a trade mission into a military operation. The immense reward for surviving this gauntlet came into view long before they reached the city walls. The glow of Constantinople could be seen for miles, a beacon of civilization. As the Vikings rounded the final bend in the Bosporus, the sight that greeted them was unlike anything in their known world. The immense Theodosian walls, towering 40 feet high and stretching for miles, seemed to be a fortress built by giants. Behind them, the golden domes of churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, glittered in the sun. The city teemed with over 500,000 people, a population larger than the entire Norse world combined. The air was filled with the sounds of a dozen languages and the smells of spices they couldn't name. For a Norseman, this was the edge of the world, and it was made of gold. The Byzantines, for their part, viewed these tall, fierce northerners with a mixture of awe and pragmatism. They saw their potential not just as traders, but as the most fearsome shock troops in the known world. This led to one of the most fascinating deals in history. The Byzantine emperors formally signed treaties with the Viking Rus, granting them incredibly lucrative trade rights, permission to enter the city, a designated commercial quarter, and exemptions from certain taxes. In return, the Vikings agreed to provide military service. From this arrangement, the legendary Varangian Guard was born, an elite personal force for the Byzantine emperor comprised primarily of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors. These men became the emperor's most loyal bodyguards, his firemen sent to the most dangerous fronts of the empire. They were paid handsomely in gold, silk, and prestige, their fame echoing all the way back to Iceland. To serve in the Varangian Guard was to secure a fortune and a story that would be told for generations. Yet for all the glory of Constantinople and the wealth of the Volga, the true heart of the Viking trading world wasn't in the glittering south, but in the misty fjords of the north. It was a place where the global and the local collided, a humming, smoky, polyglot metropolis that would have stunned a visitor with its sheer noise and activity. This was Hedeby, the greatest marketplace of the Norse world, a trading hub so vital that its influence rippled across continents. Located at the base of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now northern Germany, Hedeby's position was a masterstroke of economic geography. It sat at the narrowest overland point between the Baltic and North Seas. For a merchant, this was a priceless shortcut. Instead of risking the treacherous, weeks-long sea journey around the tip of Denmark, a captain could sail his Knarr into the sheltered inlet of the Schlei Fjord, unload his cargo at Hedeby's bustling docks, and have it carted overland by wagon for just a short 12-mile journey to the rivers flowing into the North Sea. From there, goods could be reloaded onto another ship and sent on their way to England, Francia, or beyond. Hedeby was the ultimate transshipment port, the central switchboard of Northern European trade, and it grew fabulously wealthy by controlling this crucial choke point. Walking through Hedeby at its peak around the year 1000 would have been an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke from hundreds of workshops, the tang of salted fish, and the distinct aroma of tanning leather. The sound of hammers on anvils rang out constantly from the blacksmiths' forges, while the creak of wagons and the shouts of merchants, haggling in a dozen different languages, filled the streets. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of over 350 densely packed workshops and homes within its semi-circular defensive ramparts, a hive of industry crammed into just 60 acres. This wasn't just a place to trade goods. It was a massive factory town where raw materials were transformed into high-value products. There were workshops for glass bead makers, their kilns firing sands and minerals into colorful trade items. Amber workers carved the golden resin from the Baltic into intricate beads and pendants. Jewelers crafted brooches and rings from imported silver and gold. Textile producers wove the famous Norse wool cloth, known as varmol, which was a standardized form of currency in itself. Bone and antler were worked into everything from combs and needle cases to elaborate game pieces. Hedeby was a powerhouse of value-added production, where a raw tusk from Greenland could enter and leave as a set of finely carved chessmen, worth many times its original value. The sheer diversity of objects unearthed from its muddy soil tells the story of a truly global marketplace. A merchant or a customer in Hedeby could find Frankish swords, sleek Rhineland glass drinking horns, shimmering Byzantine silks, intricate Slavic jewelry, and even cowrie shells from the Red Sea, drilled to be worn as pendants. But the most telling finds are the coins, thousands upon thousands of them. Silver dirhams from Baghdad, Anglo-Saxon pennies, Frankish dinars, and coins minted right there in Hedeby itself, stamped with the town's name and a ship, a proud declaration of its economic independence. This was a place where wealth was constantly being counted, weighed on those finely balanced scales, and reinvested into the next venture. A person's status was displayed not just by the jewelry they wore, but by its origin. A brooch from Ireland spoke of Atlantic connections, while a belt buckle from the east whispered of adventures on the Volga. Hedeby was more than a town. It was a physical manifestation of the Viking commercial spirit. It had no great palaces or cathedrals. Its power was not rooted in a king or an army, but in the collective ambition of its merchants and artisans. It was a neutral ground, a free port where anyone with something to sell or the silver to buy could find a market. For 3 centuries, it thrived as the pulsating heart of the north, a place where the world came to trade. While Hedeby dominated the crossroads of continental trade, another powerhouse was rising in the east, one that controlled the very gates of Scandinavia. Nestled on the island of Birka in Lake Mälaren, the town of Birka served as Sweden's strategic gateway, a fortified hub where the vast resources of the Scandinavian interior met the hungry markets of the wider world. Its location was a masterclass in economic foresight. In the Viking Age, Lake Mälaren was a saltwater bay opening directly into the Baltic Sea, making Birka a perfectly sheltered deep water port, accessible to the largest Knarr. More importantly, it sat at the terminus of a web of rivers and overland trails that stretched deep into the untamed forests of what is now Sweden and Finland. This was the collection point for the North's most precious commodities, the starting pistol for their journey across the globe. What flowed into Birka was the raw wealth of a continent. From the vast, cold woodlands came an endless supply of furs, sable, marten, beaver, and Arctic fox. each pelt more valuable than the last in the luxury markets of the East and West. Iron, mined and smelted using techniques the Norse had perfected over centuries, was forged into bars known as Osmand iron, a trademark product renowned across Europe for its exceptional quality and consistency. This iron was the steel of its day, highly sought after for weaponry and tools. And in the darkest chapter of this trade, Birka was also a major hub for human traffic. Slaves, often captured during raids or traded from Baltic tribes, were a horrifyingly high-value commodity, moved through Birka on their way to a life of servitude in distant lands. The town itself was a testament to its importance, a bustling, well-defended commercial center. A high wooden rampart, topped with defensive towers, encircled the town, protecting its warehouses, workshops, and some 1,000 inhabitants from rival raiders. The harbor would have been a forest of masts, with ships from Denmark, Norway, the Baltic states, and even further afield jostling for space at the docks. The air was filled with the sounds of commerce conducted in a dozen languages, the clink of scales, and the smell of tar, timber, and smoked fish. Birka was more than a market. It was a melting pot, a place where Norse customs blended with Slavic, Baltic, and Eastern influences, creating a unique and cosmopolitan culture. Perhaps the most revolutionary discovery from Birka's soil challenges our very perception of Viking society. In the 1870s, archaeologist H. Hjalmar Stolp uncovered an incredibly rich burial, known as the BJ 581 grave. The occupant was laid to rest in a seated position, dressed in fine silk clothing and surrounded by an arsenal of weapons: a sword, an axe, a fighting knife, 2 shields, and a quiver of arrows. Nearby were the skeletons of 2 horses, a sign of immense prestige. For over a century, this was assumed to be the grave of a great male warlord. But in 2017, a genomic analysis revealed a stunning truth. The warrior in Birka was biologically female. This revelation sent shockwaves through the historical community. The traditional image of Viking women tending the hearth while men went raiding was instantly complicated. Here was a woman who was not merely a participant in the warrior culture, but a high-ranking leader within it, buried with the full honors of a professional fighter. While debate continues on her exact role, was she a military commander, a leader of mercenaries protecting trade routes, or a high-status individual whose burial reflected her symbolic authority? The find is undeniable proof that women in the Viking Age could wield immense social and economic power. She may have been a trader who commanded her own ships and required protection on perilous routes, or perhaps she was the one providing that protection. Her grave forces us to see Viking society as far more complex, where status was earned and displayed in ways that were not strictly bound by gender. And then, as suddenly as it rose, Birka's story ends. Around the year 970, the vibrant heart of Swedish trade simply stopped beating. The reasons for its abrupt abandonment remain one of Scandinavia's great mysteries, but archaeologists point to a confluence of factors. A shift in the land, the post-glacial rebound, began to elevate the entire region, slowly silting up the channels that connected Lake Mälaren to the Baltic Sea. What was once a deep water port was becoming a landlocked lake, strangling the town's economic lifeline. At the same time, the center of political power was shifting. A new town, Sigtuna, was founded by the rising Swedish monarchy, offering royal patronage and protection that Birka, an independent merchant republic, could not match. The final blow may have been a catastrophic raid or a widespread fire, evidence of which has been found in the layers of ash. The people simply left, taking their goods and their skills to new homes, leaving the empty workshops and silent ramparts to be slowly reclaimed by the earth. a ghost town holding the secrets of a forgotten gateway. While the eastern routes buzzed with the commerce of empires and the steady towns of Hedeby and Birka hummed with industry, another breed of Viking was setting their sails toward the setting sun, drawn by different whispers on the wind. This was the Western Sea Road, a path of immense danger and even greater opportunity that would lead not just to trade, but to the permanent reshaping of the North Atlantic world. Their journey began along the fractured, fjord-cut coast of Norway, where ambitious chieftains looked across the water not toward the riches of the east, but toward the scattered islands on the horizon, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, and the Hebrides. This was not a journey for the faint of heart. The sailing conditions here were arguably the most brutal they faced. They were battling the full, unimpeded force of the North Atlantic, with its sudden, violent squalls and currents that could push a ship hopelessly off course into the open ocean. Navigation was a matter of life and death, relying on the keen observation of seabirds, the color of the water, and the subtle smell of land carried on the wind. Yet the rewards for those who mastered this route were immense. These islands were not empty. They were home to Pictish and Gaelic communities, rich in the two things a Norse chieftain valued most: land for his followers and wealth for his coffers. The initial phase was one of predation. Viking longships descended upon isolated monastic communities like Lindisfarne and Arna, soft targets that were utterly unprepared for such swift and ruthless attacks. The plunder from these raids gem-studded reliquaries, silver chalices, and beautifully illuminated manuscripts provided the initial capital, the seed money for larger ambitions. But very quickly, the Norse approach evolved from simple hit-and-run raids to a more complex strategy of conquest and colonization. They began to overwinter, establishing fortified camps that slowly grew into permanent settlements. They weren't just visiting, they were moving in. This shift, from raiding to trading to settling, created a unique economic ecosystem across the Irish Sea region. The Norse established powerful coastal town ports that acted as hubs for a booming maritime economy. The most famous of these was Dublin, founded as a longfort, or ship fortress, around the year 840. From bases like this, they began to control and dominate the flow of distinctive goods. One of the most sought-after commodities was the thick, high-quality woolen cloth produced in Ireland. Known for its durability and weather resistance, this cloth became a staple trade item, shipped back to Norway and beyond. Another, far darker trade flourished alongside it, the slave trade. The Vikings became the primary traffickers in human beings across the North Atlantic. They raided Gaelic villages for captives, who were then marched in chains to markets in Dublin, Cork, and Waterford. From there, these Irish slaves, or trelia, were exported to points across the Norse world. A wealthy Icelandic farmer might purchase an Irish slave to help clear land, while a powerful chieftain in Norway might show off his status by having a Gaelic servant. This horrific exchange of human lives was a cornerstone of the Western economy, funding further expansion and entrenching Norse power. But perhaps the most fascinating and valuable commodity to emerge from the extreme West was not found on land, but in the icy waters of the Arctic. As the Norse pushed further, settling the lonely coast of Greenland, they discovered a resource more precious than gold: walrus ivory. The Greenlandic walrus population offered a near monopoly on a material that was in desperate demand across all of Europe. While elephant ivory from Africa was rare and prohibitively expensive, walrus ivory was a northern product the Vikings could control entirely. Norse hunters developed incredibly dangerous techniques to harvest the tusks from these massive, aggressive animals from small, open boats. The raw tusks, or the entire heads, were then transported back to trading centers. The craftsmanship involved was expert. Artisans in towns like Dublin and Trondheim would skillfully carve the ivory into the most exquisite luxury items of the age. Elaborate crucifixes and private devotional diptychs for the clergy, beautifully detailed chess pieces for nobility, and ornate knife handles and jewelry for the wealthy elite. The famous Lewis chessmen, discovered in Scotland, are believed to be masterpieces of 12th century Norse ivory work, likely carved from Greenlandic walrus tusk. This trade became the economic lifeblood of the remote Norse Greenland colony, connecting this distant outpost directly to the cathedrals and courts of Europe. It was this relentless drive for new land and resources that led to the most legendary journey of all, the accidental discovery of Iceland. According to the sagas, the island was found by a sailor named Nadod, who was blown off course while sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands. He called it Snaland, or Snowland. What they found was a volcanic island of staggering beauty and harsh reality, largely uninhabited except for a few Irish monks seeking solitude. This was the ultimate prize: vast, unclaimed, fertile land. The settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century was one of the most rapid and complete migrations in history. Within a few decades, thousands of Norse families, along with their Celtic slaves and servants, had made the treacherous crossing to carve out a new society. They were driven by a thirst for land and freedom, escaping the growing power of Harald Fairhair, the king who was unifying Norway under his rule. In Iceland, they established a unique commonwealth, a republic of chieftains without a king, whose laws and stories were preserved in the great sagas. This wasn't just a trade outpost. It was a new nation, born directly from the routes and ambitions of the Western Sea Road. The connections back to the British Isles remained strong, with ships constantly sailing between Iceland, Ireland, and Norway, carrying timber, grain, and news, ensuring that even this remote new world remained a vital part of the Norse commercial network. Yet the most astonishing chapter of the Western Sea Road was written not on the green shores of Iceland, but on the very edge of the known world, on a land so harsh and remote, it seemed to defy human habitation. This was Greenland, and the Norse settlement there stands as one of history's greatest testaments to adaptation and economic specialization. For centuries, we've been told the story of Greenland's failure, a cautionary tale of a society that collapsed under the weight of a changing climate and its own stubbornness. But that narrative misses the incredible truth. For over 400 years, Greenland wasn't a failed settlement. It was a wildly successful, highly specialized economic outpost, a remote factory at the top of the world, producing some of the most sought-after luxury goods in all of Europe. The key to understanding Greenland's success lies in a single, precious commodity: walrus ivory. While we think of medieval luxury items being made from elephant ivory, that material was incredibly rare and difficult to obtain for most European artisans. Greenland's walrus herds offered a stunning alternative. The Norse Greenlanders became expert hunters, venturing out into the treacherous Davis straight in small, open boats to harvest these colossal animals. It was brutally dangerous work, but the payoff was immense. A single good-sized tusk could be worth a fortune. But the Greenlanders didn't just export raw tusks. They often processed the ivory themselves, sometimes shipping entire walrus skulls with the tusks still attached, or crafting the ivory into rough blanks, ready for European craftsmen to transform into exquisite artworks. This wasn't a side business. It was the absolute core of Greenland's economy. The evidence is etched into the very landscape. At the largest Norse farm, known as Gardar, archaeologists found the remains of a specialized structure that wasn't a barn or a house, but a dedicated storage building for walrus skulls. Imagine walking into that shed, row upon row of massive skulls, their long, curved tusks pointing toward the ceiling, a vast warehouse of wealth waiting for the next ship to arrive. This was their bank vault. And we know exactly how valuable this trade was because of a remarkable historical document. A 1426 tax record from the Diocese of Nidaros in Norway. It states that the Greenland tithe was paid for that year with 620 pounds of walrus ivory. To put that into perspective, that's the tusks from over 400 animals, and it was considered enough to cover an entire year's ecclesiastical tax. This was not a struggling community. This was a prosperous one, built on a luxury goods monopoly. But ivory wasn't their only export. The second pillar of the Greenland economy was something far softer, but no less valuable: wool. The Greenland Norse became master sheep farmers, and the wool they produced was unlike any other. The sheep, bred in isolation for centuries in the harsh Arctic climate, developed a fleece that was exceptionally fine, strong, and warm. The Greenlanders then processed this wool into a high-quality cloth known as vadmal. This wasn't just any cloth. It was a standardized product, woven to a specific width and length that made it a form of currency throughout the Norse world. A length of vadmal could be used to pay taxes, buy goods, or even settle legal fines. Greenland's vadmal was considered some of the best, a premium product that commanded high prices. The scale of this industry is still visible today. At the farm known as Osterbygden, the ruins of the buildings are surrounded by vast, stone-walled enclosures that aren't for keeping animals in, but for keeping them out. These are the remains of extensive home fields, carefully protected from grazing sheep, so that the Norse could harvest grass to make hay to feed their flocks through the long, dark winter. Their entire agricultural system was meticulously engineered around sustaining the largest possible number of sheep. Every aspect of their society, from the size of their barns to the layout of their farms, was optimized for the production of these two luxury goods: ivory and wool. So what changed? How did this successful, adaptable colony vanish? The answer isn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, insidious unraveling of the very trade networks that gave it life. The Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that began in the 13th century, didn't just make Greenland colder, it made it isolated. The sea ice around Greenland began to advance, making the already perilous shipping routes from Iceland and Norway even more dangerous and unpredictable. A journey that was once a calculated risk became a near-suicidal gamble. The number of ships arriving from Europe dwindled to a trickle, and then eventually stopped altogether. This isolation had a catastrophic domino effect. Without regular trade ships, the Greenlanders lost their access to essential imports they couldn't produce themselves. Things like iron for tools and weapons, timber for boat repair and building, and grain to supplement their diet. An archaeological dig at a Greenland farm tells a haunting story. As the decades of isolation wore on, the finds of metal objects become rarer and rarer. We see evidence of broken tools being painstakingly repaired over and over again, until they were nothing more than slivers of their original selves. When a prized iron knife finally broke beyond repair, it might be reshaped into a smaller awl or a needle. Every last fragment of metal squeezed for its utility. The final cruel blow to their economy was a shift in European tastes. Right at the moment Greenland needed its trade the most, the market for its primary export collapsed. As trade routes to Africa opened up, elephant ivory began to flood into European markets. For a wealthy nobleman commissioning a new religious diptych, elephant ivory was now the preferred material. It was larger, easier to carve in intricate detail, and became a new symbol of status. The market for walrus ivory, Greenland's lifeblood, evaporated almost overnight. The colony didn't fail because the people were incapable of surviving in Greenland. They had done so for centuries. It failed because their reason for existing in such a remote place, their economic purpose, vanished. The world they had so brilliantly plugged into for 400 years had moved on, leaving them stranded at the edge of the ice. Their vaults full of a commodity nobody wanted anymore. But the story doesn't end in Greenland. For the most ambitious of these Norse explorers, the lands to the west still whispered of even greater possibilities. Beyond the ice, beyond the empty shores, lay a place of myth and tantalizing evidence, a land they called Vinland. The saga accounts of Leif Erikson's journey around the year 1000 are well known. A tale of finding wild grapes and building temporary shelters. But the true enigma of Vinland isn't about a single exploratory voyage. It's about what happened next. It's the sparse, fragmented, yet utterly compelling evidence that suggests the Greenlanders didn't just visit North America. They established a sporadic but persistent trade relationship with its indigenous inhabitants, the people they called the Skraeling. The most famous archaeological evidence for Norse presence in North America is, of course, Elance Orks Meadows in Newfoundland. This site, a small cluster of Norse-style buildings, proves they crossed the Atlantic. But it's what was found inside those buildings that hints at a story far larger than a simple base camp. Among the artifacts were the remains of butternuts. Now, a butternut is a type of walnut, and its range is very specific. These nuts do not grow, and have never grown, anywhere near Elance Orks Meadows. The closest natural groves are located hundreds of miles to the south, in the St. Lawrence River Valley and parts of New Brunswick. This means the Norse occupants of that camp did not just explore their immediate coastline. They must have undertaken significant journeys southward, either by ship or perhaps through trade networks, to acquire these items. A butternut is not a necessary survival food. It's a luxury, a taste of something different. Its presence suggests exploration with intent, a deliberate effort to seek out and sample the resources of this new world. The sagas themselves provide the framework for what this trade might have looked like. They describe encounters with the Skraelings that often began with fear and violence, but occasionally settled into a tense, silent form of barter. The Norse would lay out their goods, likely strips of cloth, perhaps bits of milk or cheese, maybe small pieces of worked metal, on the ground. They would then retreat. The indigenous people would approach, examine the offerings, and lay down their own goods next to them, primarily furs and pelts, before also withdrawing. If the Norse were satisfied with the exchange, they would take the furs and leave their goods behind. This was trade without a shared language, without formal markets, a fragile and cautious meeting of two worlds on a windswept beach. The Norse, coming from a Greenland with almost no trees, would have been absolutely astounded by the vast, dense forests of North America. And for the Greenlanders, a prime beaver pelt or a bundle of luxurious fox furs was a direct line back to the wealthy markets of Europe. This transatlantic trade, however small scale, had the potential to be incredibly lucrative. The question that haunts historians is one of scale and duration. Was this a regular, organized operation? Or was it a handful of desperate, opportunistic voyages undertaken by a few bold Greenlanders over the centuries? The sagas tell us the Norse eventually abandoned their Vinland camp due to the constant threat of hostile encounters. The sheer numerical superiority of the indigenous populations made any permanent settlement impossible. But giving up on a colony is not the same as giving up on a resource. The economic incentive for a Greenland chieftain to risk a voyage to Markland, their name for the forested region believed to be Labrador for timber, or even further south for furs, would have been overwhelming. Their entire society in Greenland was dependent on wood for boat repair, building, and toolmaking. A single successful voyage could bring back enough precious lumber to keep a community afloat for years. Imagine a Greenlandic Knarr, its hull scarred by sea ice, cautiously sailing down the coast of Labrador. Its crew isn't looking for a fight. They're looking for a quiet, sheltered cove. They're there to cut down tall, straight trees for timber, to hunt for game to supplement their food supplies, and perhaps to make that cautious, silent trade for pelts that are worth more than their weight in silver back in Europe. They would work quickly, nervously, always watching the tree line, before loading their ship and catching the right winds for the dangerous return journey home. These wouldn't be annual events, but perhaps generational. A story a grandfather told his grandson, a secret map passed down, a gamble taken when times were especially hard, or when a particularly ambitious leader arose. The true scale of this contact may be lying undiscovered not in grand settlements, but in the most subtle of places. If trade occurred, Norse objects would have entered indigenous communities. A piece of Norse wool cloth, a fragment of a smithied iron nail, a distinctive ringed pin, these items would have been curiosities, talismans, traded far inland through existing native networks. Conversely, in Greenlandic archaeology, we should be looking for evidence of North American goods beyond butternuts. A distinctive type of stone point, a fragment of a ceramic style unknown in Europe, or even genetic evidence could one day tell a more complete story. The enigma of Vinland is no longer a question of if the Norse were there, but of how deeply they interacted with a continent that was already teeming with life and complex cultures. It represents the very first, fragile thread of transatlantic connection, a preview of the globalized world to come, stretching across the ocean centuries before Columbus. Their ships may have been the marvel, and their routes the arteries of commerce, but it was the cargo within their holds that truly fueled the Viking Age. This was an economy built on desire, on the specific cravings of distant markets for a handful of extraordinary commodities. Three goods above all others represented the lifeblood of their trade: the luxurious warmth of northern fur, the tragic human cost of captured slaves, and the golden, mystical allure of Baltic amber. From the vast, silent taiga forests of Scandinavia and Russia came what might be considered the ultimate luxury item of the early medieval world: fur. But we're not talking about simple animal skins. The most sought-after furs were those of the sable, the beaver, and the Arctic fox. In the sun-baked courts of the Abbasid Caliphate, or the stone-walled halls of Frankish kings, these pelts were more than just warmth. They were the ultimate status symbol. A caliph in Baghdad, surrounded by desert heat, might drape himself in the deep, dark, lustrous fur of a sable to project an image of power and immense wealth, a walking display of his far-reaching connections. Beaver fur, with its unique barbed hairs, was exceptionally effective at being felted into the finest, most water-resistant hats for the European elite. The value of these furs cannot be overstated. A single prime sable pelt could be worth a small fortune, and a shipload represented capital that could fund a chieftain's ambitions for years. The Norse, with their access to the prime hunting grounds and their networks with indigenous Finno-Ugric trappers, held a near monopoly on the very best of this trade, making it a cornerstone of their eastern voyages. If fur was the commodity of luxury, then human beings were the commodity of brutal utility. The slave trade, or trelkan as they called it, was an undeniable and horrific engine of the Viking economy. These slaves, known as trailer thralls, were acquired through raids on coastal villages from Ireland to Iberia, but also through targeted campaigns in the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe, the very origin of the word slave. A successful raid was measured not just in plundered gold, but in the number of captives taken. These people were then transported in chains along the established trade routes, becoming living, breathing cargo. The primary market for this human traffic was the Islamic world, where a strong young Slavic man or a skilled Celtic woman could fetch an enormous price in silver dirhams. But the demand was also internal. A prosperous Icelandic settler needed labor to clear his land. A coroner in Norway required servants to maintain his household status. And any large-scale project like shipbuilding or construction relied on this forced labor. The slave trade was so deeply integrated into their society that the law codes meticulously outlined a thrall's worth and the penalties for harming someone else's human property. It was a dark, pervasive reality that financed voyages, built homesteads, and created an underclass that supported the entire structure of Norse prosperity. And then there was amber, the gold of the north, washed up on the shores of the Baltic Sea, particularly around modern-day Poland and the Kaliningrad region. This fossilized tree resin was coveted for its beauty and its mystery. When polished, it transforms into a warm, glowing gemstone, lightweight and easy to carve into beads, pendants, and intricate figurines. But its value went far beyond the aesthetic. From antiquity, amber was believed to hold powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was thought to ward off evil spirits, cure ailments from sore throats to heart problems, and even protect the wearer from harm. The ancient Greeks called it electron, named for its ability to generate a static charge when rubbed, a property that seemed to confirm its otherworldly nature. The Vikings, positioned as the gatekeepers to the primary source of this material, controlled its flow to the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean. They collected the raw nuggets from the beaches, and workshops in towns like Hedeby and Birka transformed them into high-value finished goods. A strand of perfectly spherical Baltic amber beads, found in a burial in England, tells a silent story of a long and perilous journey, from a distant shore to a wealthy owner, all facilitated by Norse traders who understood the immense value of this seemingly simple yellow stone. Together, fur, slaves, and amber formed a powerful economic trinity, driving expansion, funding exploration, and connecting the frozen north to the glittering south in a complex web of desire and commerce. Now, to truly grasp the scale of this economic revolution, we must journey inland, away from the bustling ports and treacherous sea routes, and into the quiet Scandinavian countryside. For it is here, buried in the soil of farmsteads and hidden along ancient pathways, that we find the most compelling and tangible evidence of the Viking world's deep entanglement with global trade, the silver hoard. These were not the neatly stacked coin collections of a numismatist, but something far more raw and revealing clumps of dirt-encrusted treasure, often containing thousands of Islamic silver dirhams, many brutally hacked into pieces. This was the lifeblood of the Norse economy, a fluid form of wealth known as hack silver. The system was brilliantly simple and incredibly practical. Unlike later economies that relied on coins with a fixed, stamped value, the Norse operated on a pure weight-based system. The value of any transaction was determined not by the face of a coin, but by the precise weight of the precious metal being exchanged. This is why those finely crafted scales and weights we find in Viking graves were so indispensable. A merchant selling a pack of furs wouldn't receive a stack of whole coins. He would receive a payment carefully measured out on his scales, which could consist of whole coins, fragments of coins, chopped up bracelets, or twisted silver rings, whatever combination achieved the exact weight required. A dirham might be chopped into halves, quarters, or even smaller. Razor-thin slivers to make small change for everyday purchases. This meant that silver in all its forms was endlessly recyclable and universally accepted across the Norse world and far beyond its borders. A piece of a coin minted in Baghdad could be used to buy a loaf of bread in Denmark, a new axe head in Ireland, or to pay a fine in Iceland. It was a truly globalized currency centuries before the concept even existed. This reliance on weight also reveals a sophisticated understanding of trust and integrity in commerce. The consistency of those standardized weights was sacred. To cheat on the weight was to commit a profound social sin, undermining the very trust that allowed such a decentralized economy to function. The practice of testing the purity of silver was also common. We find numerous coins and silver objects with small nicks or cut marks, known as pecking. This was a buyer testing the metal to ensure it wasn't just a silver-plated forgery. Every transaction was a careful ritual of measurement and verification. The geographic distribution of these hoards paints a vivid map of economic flow and personal anxiety. The vast majority of these buried treasures are found in what is now Sweden, particularly on the island of Gotland, which sits like a spider in the center of the Baltic Sea trade web. The sheer density of hoards on Gotland is staggering, suggesting it was the absolute epicenter of this silver wealth, the clearinghouse where profits from east and west were consolidated. But hoards are found all across the Norse diaspora, from Ireland to Russia, and the composition of these hoards acts as a time capsule. By analyzing the mint marks and dates on the dirhams, archaeologists can trace waves of silver influx. The largest pulse occurred between the 9th and 10th centuries, corresponding with the peak of the Volga trade route and the height of silver mining in the Islamic world. Later hoards often contain a greater mix of European coins, reflecting the shifting currents of trade and power as the Viking Age progressed. Ultimately, these buried treasures tell two simultaneous stories. On one hand, they are a testament to spectacular success, the hard proof of profits won from perilous journeys to distant markets. A chieftain returning from the east might bury a portion of his wealth as a secure savings account, a nest egg for his family or a fund for his next expedition. But on the other hand, every buried hoard is also a story of fear and sudden flight. Silver was buried in times of extreme peril, during a raid, a civil war, or an invasion. The owner intended to return and retrieve it when the danger passed. The fact that so many were never recovered speaks to the profound instability that often underpinned this age of commerce. The same routes that brought immense wealth also brought devastating conflict. Each unearthed hoard is a frozen moment of panic, a silent scream from the past where someone, facing an imminent threat, chose to hide their life's work in the earth, hoping for a tomorrow that, for them, never came. This reliance on a weight-based economy meant that a merchant's most valuable asset wasn't just his silver, but his reputation for absolute honesty. In a world without banks or centralized authority, a transaction was a personal contract sealed by the precise dip of a scales beam. To be caught using false weights was a social and professional death sentence, a betrayal that could blacklist a trader from the entire network. His standing in the community, his very honor, was directly tied to the integrity of his measurements. This profound sense of personal accountability was woven into their very mythology. The Norse gods themselves presided over concepts of fairness and measure. Thor, the protector of Midgard, was not just a god of thunder, but also a guardian of the common law and the sanctity of oaths, while the god Forseti was specifically invoked for justice and dispute resolution. The artifacts they left behind are stunning testaments to this culture of precision. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of these weight sets, and they are far from crude lumps of metal. Many are miniature works of art, crafted from bronze and often adorned with intricate design spirals, animal motifs, and even faces, that were then filled with bright, gleaming tin to make the patterns stand out. These weren't just tools, they were statements of identity and success, the elegant briefcases of their day. A merchant would carry them in a small leather pouch on his belt, a portable bureau of standards that allowed him to conduct business anywhere in the world, from a beach in Scotland to a riverbank in Russia. The weights themselves were part of an internationally recognized system, often based on the Islamic ukiah, which weighed about 27 grams. This standardization was crucial. It meant a Viking merchant from Hedeby could effortlessly trade with an Arabic silver dealer in Volga, both confident they were using the same units of value. Perhaps the most fascinating embodiments of this system are the folding scales, exquisite examples of early portable engineering. These were compact balance scales made of iron or bronze, with arms that could be folded inward and a central beam that pivoted for easy storage. Unfolded, they were remarkably sensitive, capable of detecting the weight of a single hair. Imagine a seasoned trader on the Volga River, his Knarr loaded with furs. A potential buyer offers a handful of hacked silver fragments. The merchant doesn't just count pieces, he calmly unfolds his scale, selects the correct decorated weight from his pouch, and carefully balances the silver against it. All eyes are on that central beam. If it hangs perfectly level, the deal is sealed on a foundation of mutual trust. That moment of equilibrium was the sound of the medieval global economy clicking into place, a silent agreement between two cultures facilitated by a technology of trust perfected in the north. This fluid identity is perfectly captured in the story of a man named Otter, a chieftain and merchant from what is now northern Norway, who found himself at the court of King Alfred the Great in England around the year 890. His account, meticulously recorded by Alfred's scribes, offers a rare first-person glimpse into this dual life. Otter wasn't some mythical figure from a saga. He was a real businessman detailing his operations. He described a vast personal domain with herds of reindeer and owned the northernmost farm known to the Norse. But his real wealth came from the sea, from a resource so abundant it funded his entire enterprise, the walrus. Every summer, Otter explained, he would launch an expedition north, into the frozen waters around the White Sea, a region no European had previously documented. His target was the walrus, hunted for their incredibly strong hide, which could be cut into superior ship ropes, and their valuable tusks. This was a high-risk, high-reward operation in uncharted territory. After a successful hunt, he would load his ship with this precious cargo and turn south, not to raid, but to trade. His destination was the important market town of Hedeby, a journey of over 1,000 miles. There, he would exchange his walrus products for goods he couldn't produce at home, primarily silver and fine glassware. But his story doesn't end in Hedeby. From there, laden with his new wealth, he would set sail for England. His stated purpose for visiting King Alfred was peaceful. He was curious, he said, to see what the land was like. Yet, the unspoken reality is that he was also there to trade, to find the best market for his goods. Here was a man who was, by turns, an Arctic explorer, an industrial scale hunter, a long-distance maritime trader, and a diplomatic visitor to a foreign king. He embodied the complete Viking entrepreneur. Yet, the very ship that carried Otter's walrus hides could, with a slight change in the wind or the sighting of an undefended coastal monastery, transform in an instant from a vessel of commerce to one of conquest. The same skills that made them excellent merchants, mastery of the sea, expert navigation, sudden mobility, and the ability to quickly assess a location's strengths and weaknesses, were the identical skills that made them terrifyingly effective raiders. A Viking fleet approaching a shore would perform a swift calculation. Were the local forces assembled and well armed, Then they would lower their weapons and announce their peaceful intent to trade. Did the coast appear poorly defended, with a rich, unguarded monastery visible just inland, the same men would raise their axes and shields, becoming an overwhelming force of plunderers. This wasn't seen as hypocrisy. It was a simple pragmatic assessment of opportunity versus risk. A successful raid provided the capital to purchase more trade goods, and a successful trade voyage funded the maintenance of the ships and warriors needed for the next raid. They were two sides of the same economic coin. This opportunistic duality is why figures like Otter are so crucial to understanding the Viking world. He defies our modern need to categorize people neatly as either merchants or warriors. He was both, and his story forces us to abandon the simplistic caricature of the mindless barbarian. These were calculating, adaptable people whose primary drive was not wanton destruction, but acquisition and advancement by any means available. Their legacy is not one of pure terror, but of a complex and often brutal pragmatism that connected the world through a combination of trade, terror, and an unwavering willingness to seize any opportunity that presented itself. Yet the true impact of these trade routes extended far beyond the mere movement of goods and silver. The ships that carried furs and ivory were also floating conduits for something far less tangible, but infinitely more transformative: ideas, art, and belief. This was a cultural exchange on a continental scale, where the Norse didn't just export products, they absorbed, adapted, and disseminated the very essence of the diverse worlds they touched, forever changing their own society in the process. One of the most visible legacies of this exchange is the breathtaking evolution of Norse art. We often imagine Viking art as the swirling, fierce animal styles of the early Viking age, like the gripping beasts and intricate interlace of the Oseberg ship burial. But as traders penetrated deeper into foreign lands, their artistic vocabulary exploded with new influences. Through contact with the Celtic world, particularly Ireland, they incorporated intricate knotwork and spirals into their metalwork and stone carvings. From the Franks and the Carolingian Empire, they adopted more naturalistic depictions of animals and plants. And most profoundly, from the East, through their interactions with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, they encountered entirely new motifs. The famous urn style, the last great Viking art form, is a perfect fusion of these influences. Its elegant, interlaced creatures, with their sleek, elongated bodies, reflect a sophistication that could only have come from exposure to the classical and oriental styles flowing into Scandinavia along the trade routes. A brooch found in Sweden might blend a Norse dragon with a Byzantine pearl border pattern, while a runestone in Denmark could feature a cross interwoven with a traditional serpent. A silent testament to the cultural melting pot these merchants navigated. This fusion is powerfully evident in the everyday objects they cherished. A beautifully carved, whalebone plaque from the British Isles, used for smoothing linen, might be found in a grave in Norway, its Celtic designs now part of a Norse household. Silver dirhams from Baghdad were often repurposed by Norse silversmiths into stunning pendant jewelry. But rather than leaving them plain, they frequently added their own filigree borders or punched their own runic inscriptions onto the Islamic coins, physically merging two cultures into a single piece of wearable art. This was not mere imitation. It was creative adaptation, a confident statement that they were part of a wider world and could make its influences their own. Perhaps the most profound cultural shift, one directly tied to the pragmatism of trade, was the slow and complex adoption of Christianity. For centuries, the Norse pantheon of Odin, Thor, and Freyja was deeply intertwined with their identity and worldview. But as their commercial ambitions grew, their pagan beliefs became a significant business liability. Christian Europe, their biggest trading partner, viewed pagans with deep suspicion, often imposing higher tariffs, restricting market access, or outright refusing to do business with them. To be a pagan was bad for business. The conversion, therefore, was often a top-down, strategic decision made by chieftains and kings who understood the economic benefits of joining the Christian club. A baptism could open doors to lucrative trade agreements, political alliances, and royal marriages. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth, who famously unified Denmark and Norway, didn't just convert for spiritual reasons. He did it to strengthen his political position and smooth relations with the powerful Christian Holy Roman Empire to his south. His conversion, memorialized on the Jelling stone, was as much a diplomatic and commercial announcement as a religious one. This isn't to say the transition was swift or complete. For generations, many Norse people practiced a syncretic form of belief, hedging their bets. Archaeological finds reveal individuals buried with both a cross around their neck and a Thor's hammer amulet in their pouch. They might be baptized and take a Christian name for business dealings abroad, while still invoking the old gods for a safe journey at sea. Over time, however, the new faith took root, facilitated by the same networks that moved goods. Christian missionaries from England and Germany traveled back on Norse trading vessels, while Norse travelers witnessed the immense wealth and power of Christian kingdoms firsthand, seeing their magnificent stone cathedrals and the organized might of the church. The religion of the trading partner gradually became the religion of the trader, not through conquest alone, but through the relentless, persuasive force of commerce and connection. The exchange of words was another constant and lasting transfer. The Old Norse language was incredibly influential, leaving its mark from the rivers of Russia to the shores of England. But it was also a borrower. As Norse traders settled in foreign lands, they encountered concepts, objects, and technologies for which they had no words, and so they adopted them. From the East, they likely acquired words related to luxury goods and navigation. From the Celts, they picked up terms for specific types of cloth and legal concepts. Even the word for money itself in some Scandinavian languages, penge in Danish, derives from the Old Norse penninga, which itself was borrowed from a Germanic root, highlighting the foreign origin of a monetized economy. Every time a modern Icelander or Norwegian uses certain words, they are unconsciously echoing the conversations that took place on a smoky dock in Hedeby or a riverbank in Novgorod 1,000 years ago. Finally, this cultural exchange fundamentally reshaped Norse identity and ambition. Exposure to the grandeur of Constantinople, the wealth of Baghdad, and the organized kingdoms of Europe changed how the Norse saw themselves. They moved from being peripheral raiders and independent chieftains to aspiring members of the European stage. They began to mint their own coins in imitation of those they saw abroad, a powerful declaration of sovereignty and economic maturity. They built larger, more permanent trading towns that began to resemble the urban centers they visited in England and Francia. The flow of ideas about governance, law, and kingship that came back with the ships, and the silver helped to catalyze the unification of the Scandinavian kingdoms themselves. The Viking Age didn't end because they were defeated. It ended because they were successfully integrated, because they had taken so much from the world they once raided that they ultimately became a part of it, forever changed by the endless, fruitful exchange they themselves had pioneered. Yet for all the wealth flowing through bustling ports like Hedeby, that commercial heart required protection. Imagine a king gazing at a map of his realm, recognizing that his greatest asset was also his greatest vulnerability. The riches of the north were a glittering prize, and to the south lay an empire with a hungry gaze, the Franks, under the ambitious ruler Charlemagne, who saw the pagan Danes as a threat to be conquered and converted. The response to this looming danger was not a mere palisade or a simple ditch. It was one of the most ambitious military engineering projects of early medieval Europe, a statement in earth and timber and stone that echoed for centuries. This was the Danevirke. The name itself, Danevirke, translates simply to Danish work, but this was a profound understatement. It was not a single wall, but a complex, evolving system of fortifications that stretched across the narrow neck of the Jutland Peninsula, from the treacherous marshes of the west to the sheltered fjords of the Baltic in the east. Its initial construction in the early 8th century, even before the Viking Age, is traditionally thought to have begun, reveals a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics and economics. This was a sovereign border, a defiant line in the sand, or rather in the turf declaring this far, and no further to any Frankish army marching north. But to view the Danevirke solely as a defensive barrier is to miss half of its genius, and indeed the true pragmatism of its Danish builders. While it certainly served as a formidable bulwark against military invasion, its function was equally, if not more, economic. It was the ultimate toll booth, a controlled gateway that channeled all north-south land traffic through a handful of heavily fortified gates. Any merchant, any wagon train of goods moving between the continent and the Danish islands, had to pass through this choke point. Here, Danish authorities could not only monitor the flow of commodities, but could also impose taxes and tariffs on every item that crossed their territory. Think of the immense economic power this granted the Danish king. A Frankish merchant carrying fine glassware and wine from the Rhineland, a Saxon trader with grain or tools, a Frisian merchant with cloth, all were forced to halt their journey at the Danevirke. They would have to pay a duty, a percentage of the value of their goods, in order to proceed to the markets of Hedeby and beyond. Conversely, Norse merchants heading south with their furs, amber and slaves would also be taxed, their wealth contributing to the royal coffers before it even left the kingdom. The wall didn't just keep threats out, it locked revenue in, transforming a military necessity into a relentless, passive income stream that funded the very state it protected. The construction of the Danevirke evolved over centuries, growing in scale and complexity in direct response to the growing threats and opportunities of the age. The earliest phases were likely vast earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades. Later, under the reign of King Godfrid in the early 9th century, who felt the hot breath of Charlemagne's expansionism more than anyone, the defenses were massively reinforced. The wall was heightened and widened, and a deep water-filled moat was added to its southern face. But the most astonishing upgrade came in the 10th century, under the rule of Harald Bluetooth, the king who would famously unite Denmark and Norway. He ordered a section of the wall to be rebuilt in stone and brick, a staggering logistical feat. This was not just an improvement, it was a monumental declaration of power and permanence. A turf wall was the work of a regional chieftain. A brick wall was the signature of a civilized kingdom, a permanent institution on the European stage. This evolution tells a story of a society maturing from a collection of rival chieftains into a unified, centralized state. Maintaining and garrisoning a structure of this scale required a level of organization, resources, and royal authority that simply didn't exist in the early Viking Age. The Danevirke, therefore, is as much a symbol of the birth of Denmark as a nation as it is a military fortification. It physically manifested the power of the king, his ability to command the labor of thousands, and to control the movement of his people and their wealth. It was the iron spine of the Danish kingdom, and it ensured that the lifeblood of trade, flowing through Jutland, would strengthen the heart of the realm for generations to come. Scattered across the Scandinavian landscape, standing as silent sentinels of a vanished age, are the runestones, These massive, often beautifully carved standing stones are far more than just ancient art. They are the closest thing we have to Viking Age social media feeds, personal obituaries etched in stone for all eternity. And when we learn to read their language, a fascinating pattern emerges. A surprising number of these monuments were not raised for warriors who fell in battle, but for merchants who died far from home on trading voyages. These stones become our most personal historical documents, allowing us to trace the footsteps of individual Vikings across the known world through the heartfelt words of the families they left behind. The inscriptions follow a remarkably consistent and poignant formula. They typically begin by naming the person who commissioned the stone, almost always a grieving relative, our wife, a father, a brother. Then they name the deceased, and finally they reveal the crucial detail, the place where that person met their end. It's this last piece of information that transforms them from simple memorials into invaluable historical records. We read of men who died in Ingvar's army, a reference to a disastrous expedition to the Caspian Sea. We find stones commemorating those who perished in Greenland, the Norse name for the Byzantine Empire, a clear link to the perilous journey down the Dnieper River to Constantinople. Others fell in England, a term that could encompass the bustling trade towns of the Danelaw, as easily as a sudden raid turned sour. Perhaps the most evocative and mysterious destination recorded on these stones is Sörkland. This Norse word, meaning land of the Saracens, did not refer to a single place, but to the vast and wondrous expanse of the Islamic world, from the caliphates of Baghdad and Persia to the Emirates of Central Asia. When a runestone states that a man died in Sörkland, it places him squarely on the Volga trade route, that riverine superhighway of silver and fur. He might have succumbed to disease in the bustling market of Volga, been caught in a local conflict far from home, or simply never returned from a journey his family could scarcely imagine. The stone doesn't give us the cause of death, but it confirms his participation in the most ambitious and lucrative commercial enterprise of the age. The distribution of these stones paints a vivid map of economic ambition and personal tragedy. They are not spread evenly across Scandinavia. They cluster most densely in central Sweden, particularly in the region of Uppland, which was a powerhouse of Eastern trade. Here, the sheer concentration of stones mentioning Greece and Sörkland tells us that this community's wealth and identity were deeply intertwined with the Eastern routes. It was a high-risk, high-reward profession, and these stones are the stark statistical evidence of that risk. For every merchant who returned with enough silver to raise a stone in his own honor, there was another for whom a stone was raised in memoriam. But these inscriptions offer more than just geography. They reveal nuanced social standing. The language used on the stones commemorating merchants is every bit as respectful and honorable as that used for famed warriors. A man wasn't merely a trader, he was a fathen, a journeythen, or a korpmother, a merchant, titles carrying significant prestige. The rune carvers might praise his generosity, his skill as a sailor, or his reliability as a business partner. This tells us that success in commerce was a perfectly valid path to honor and renown within Viking society. Dying wealthy on a trading voyage in a foreign land was seen not as a failure, but as a testament to a life of ambition and adventure, a fate worthy of permanent commemoration alongside those who fell with a sword in their hand. One of the most famous examples is the Gripsholm runestone in Sweden, raised by a mother in memory of her son, Harold. The inscription reads, with a poetic and heartbreaking simplicity, "He journeyed valiantly far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle." He died in the south, in Sörkland. The phrase, "gave food to the eagle," is a classic piece of Norse kenning, a poetic metaphor meaning he died in battle. This single line masterfully blends the two pillars of the Viking identity. Harold was a merchant seeking gold, but he died like a warrior, his end commemorated with the same heroic language found in the sagas. He was the perfect embodiment of the trader-raider ideal, and his stone stands as a perfect monument to that inseparable duality. Through these silent grey stones, the abstract network of trade routes gains a deeply human dimension. We are no longer just talking about the flow of silver or the movement of goods. We are following the final journeys of individuals like Harold. Each runestone is a pin on a map, a data point in a vast, decentralized network of economic ambition that stretched from the frozen north to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. They are the ultimate proof that the Viking world was intimately connected to the globe, and that their legacy of exploration and exchange was written not only in the artifacts they left behind, but in the very rock of their homeland, forever memorializing the men who dared to travel to the edges of their world in search of fortune. While the runestones gave us words to trace these journeys, on the windswept island of Gotland, a different and even more enigmatic form of record-keeping was flourishing. Here, artisans weren't carving runes. They were crafting massive limestone canvases, some standing over 3 meters tall, into which they chiseled intricate and mysterious scenes. These are the Gotland picture stones, and they are unlike anything else from the Viking world. They are not grave markers in the traditional sense, but something far more ambitious, sequential art, a visual saga etched in stone that seems to document the entire life cycle of a voyage, from departure to adventure and finally to a hoped for glorious afterlife. The most striking and consistent feature across nearly every stone is the Viking ship itself, depicted not as a simple outline, but with an almost diagrammatic reverence for its design. We see the iconic curved prow and stern, the checkered pattern of overlapping shields lining the gunwales, and the meticulously detailed rigging of the great square sail, often billowing with a sense of motion. But these aren't generic ships, they are shown in action. Some stones depict a fleet of vessels, suggesting a communal expedition or a major trading fleet setting out together. Others show the ship being guided into port, its sail being lowered as it approaches a welcoming committee or a foreign shoreline. This is a proud celebration of the technology that made their world possible, the very engine of their trade and exploration, immortalized as the central hero of these visual stories. The narrative then unfolds on land, and this is where the stones become an archaeologist's dream and a historian's puzzle. We see clear scenes of arrival and interaction. A common motif shows a figure, often larger than others to denote importance, being greeted by a group of people. For decades, this was interpreted through a purely mythological lens, seen as a hero being welcomed into Valhalla. But a newer, more compelling interpretation is gaining ground, that these are scenes of trade and diplomacy. The central figure could be a Viking merchant chieftain being received by a local leader at a foreign port. The objects sometimes being exchanged, a drinking horn, a ring, a sword, could represent the ceremonial gifting that often preceded serious trade negotiations, establishing trust and honor between parties. Further supporting this mercantile reading are the depictions of wealth itself. Many stones are adorned with panels showing intricate patterns of interlocking rings and chains. This isn't just abstract decoration. It's a literal representation of neck rings and arm rings, a standard form of storing and displaying wealth in the Viking Age. To have such imagery prominently displayed on a monument speaks directly to a culture that celebrated commercial success and the accumulation of silver. It's a boast in stone, a permanent record of the prosperity that such perilous journeys could bring. Perhaps the most profound and layered stones blend these earthly and spiritual narratives into a single, continuous flow. The stone might begin with a ship setting out from its home shore. It would then move upward to show the successful activities on foreign soil, the meeting, the exchange of gifts, the acquisition of wealth. The story would then culminate at the top of the stone in a definitive mythological scene. A warrior arriving at Valhalla on horseback, being welcomed by a Valkyrie offering a drinking horn. This artistic structure suggests a powerful cultural belief that a successful trading voyage, conducted with skill and honor, was not just a path to wealth, but a path to glory worthy of the gods. A man who died far from home in pursuit of trade was not separated from the warrior's ideal. His journey itself was a kind of battle, his shrewdness in negotiation a form of courage, and his safe return with wealth a victory to be celebrated in this life and the next. The Gotland picture stones, in their silent, beautiful complexity, offer us the most complete visual argument that in the Viking mind, the merchant and the hero were one and the same. For all its immense profitability, the river road to the east was not a permanent highway. The very forces that created this torrent of silver-distant political decisions, economic shifts, and the ambitions of the people the Vikings had traded with, would eventually cause it to dry up. The decline of the Volga trade route wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, irreversible draining away, caused by a perfect storm of events far beyond the control of any Scandinavian merchant. The first and most devastating blow came from the source of the wealth itself, the Islamic silver mines. For centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had enjoyed a seemingly endless supply of silver, primarily from massive mines in modern-day Afghanistan. This was the engine that powered the entire northern economy, minting the millions of dirhams that flowed north. But around the turn of the 11th century, this engine began to splutter and fail. The richest veins were simply mined out, exhausted after generations of intensive extraction. Compounding this problem were major political upheavals within the Islamic world itself. Civil wars, invasions, and the fragmentation of the unified caliphate into smaller, competing emirates disrupted the complex administration and security needed to operate the mines and protect the trade caravans that carried the silver north. The great river of dirhams flowing into Volga slowed to a trickle, and then eventually stopped altogether. For the Vikings, this was an economic earthquake. The foundational commodity of their eastern trade, the very substance of their wealth, had vanished. As the silver supply withered, the political landscape of the region was transforming in a way that made the Norse traders obsolete. The Vikings themselves were the architects of this change, though they couldn't have foreseen the consequences. Decades earlier, Viking chieftains and their warriors had established themselves as the ruling elite over the Slavic tribes along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. They became the Rus, and their loose collection of trading posts gradually coalesced into a powerful, centralized state, Kievan Rus. This new kingdom, with its capital at Kiev, began to look at the Volga trade not as an opportunity for its Scandinavian cousins, but as a source of revenue to be controlled. Why should Swedish middlemen reap the profits from moving goods between the Slavs and the Muslims? The Kievan Rus rulers began to assert their own authority over the route, taxing foreign merchants heavily and eventually cutting out the Scandinavian intermediaries entirely. They established direct diplomatic and trade relations with the Byzantine Empire and the remaining Islamic powers, sending their own products down the rivers and keeping the profits for themselves. The Vikings, who had built the network, were now seen as unnecessary competitors and were systematically squeezed out by the very state they had helped to create. The final nail in the coffin was a continental shift in global trade patterns. The overland Silk Road, which had faced its own periods of disruption, began to reassert itself as a safer, and more reliable route for moving goods between China and the Mediterranean. New powers rose in Central Asia, and improvements in camel caravans made the desert crossings more efficient. At the same time, the Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa were beginning their ascent, establishing powerful fleets that dominated Mediterranean trade and offered a new all-sea route for spices and silks to reach Europe. These southern routes bypassed the river systems of Eastern Europe entirely. For a merchant in Baghdad or Constantinople, it now made more sense to send his goods west via the Mediterranean than north on the perilous journey to the land of the Rus. The Volga route, once a vital artery of global commerce, was slowly relegated to a regional backwater, its importance fading as the world's economic center of gravity shifted south and west. The era of the Viking as the master of the Eastern trade was over, not with a bang, but with the silent, empty space where the silver used to be. While the Norse networks were fraying from the loss of Eastern silver and the isolation of Greenland, a new and fundamentally different kind of power was rising in the south. This was not an era of charismatic chieftains and opportunistic raider traders, but of ledgers, treaties, and collective might. Emerging from the fertile river valleys of northern Germany, a confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities began to form, bound together not by blood or saga, but by pure commercial interest. This was the Hanseatic League, and its methodical, corporatized approach to commerce would systematically dismantle the old Viking world order and dominate the Baltic for centuries. The contrast between the two systems could not have been starker. The Viking trade model was personal, decentralized, and built on the daring of individual ship owners. A Knarr's voyage was a private enterprise, its success hinging on the courage of its crew and the shrewdness of its captain. The Hanseatic model, however, was institutional, centralized, and ruthlessly efficient. It operated through a network of contours, or fortified trading posts, established in foreign cities. The most famous of these was the Steelyard in London, but others in Bruges, Novgorod, and Bergen became the nerve centers of a vast commercial empire. Here, German merchants lived and worked under their own laws, negotiated bulk deals, and presented a unified front that local authorities could not easily oppose. Where a Viking trader might arrive with a single shipload of goods, the Hanse could dispatch entire fleets, flooding markets and dictating prices through sheer volume. This shift in scale was enabled by a revolutionary vessel, the cog. If the Viking Knarr was a nimble, all-terrain vehicle, the Hanseatic cog was a massive ocean-going freighter. With its flat bottom, high sides, and a single, enormous square sail, the cog was a floating fortress of cargo capacity. It could carry more than twice the tonnage of a Knarr, and its design was far cheaper and easier to mass produce. This allowed for the transportation of bulk commodities, grain, timber, salt, fish, and beer, on an industrial scale. The Viking economy had been built on high-value, low-volume luxuries, ivory, furs, and silk. The Hanseatic economy was built on the staples of daily life, goods that every town in Europe needed in massive quantities. This wasn't just trade, it was supply chain management on a continental level. The League's greatest weapon was not its ships, but its economic coercion. It mastered the use of trade embargoes. If a king or a city refused to grant the Hanse favorable trading terms, the League would simply shut down all commerce with them. For a city reliant on Hanseatic grain to feed its population or Hanseatic timber to build its ships, this was an existential threat. They could not easily find alternative suppliers of such volume. The Vikings had occasionally used force to get their way. The Hanse used economic pressure, a more sophisticated and often more devastating tool. This collective power allowed them to secure extraordinary privileges across Northern Europe, exempting their merchants from tariffs and tolls, and placing them effectively above local law. The impact on traditional Viking trading centers was catastrophic. Take Hedeby, once the Queen of the North. Its geographical advantage, the short overland portage between seas, was rendered obsolete by the Hanseatic mastery of the sea routes around the Jutland Peninsula. Why unload and portage goods when a cog could sail around Denmark? Its immense hold packed to the brim. Furthermore, the Hanseatic League favored their own newly founded cities. Just a short distance from Hedeby, they developed Lübeck into a gleaming new hub of Baltic trade. With its modern wharves, organized warehouses, and direct access to the overland routes into Germany, Lübeck was everything Hedeby was not: planned, efficient, and protected by the full might of the Hanse. Merchants and their capital flocked to these new centers, leaving old ports like Hedeby to stagnate. The final symbolic blow came in the 11th century when Hedeby was sacked and burned, likely by a Slavic force. It was briefly rebuilt, but its economic reason for existing had already been gutted by the Hanseatic ascendancy. It was soon abandoned completely, its role as the northern switchboard permanently usurped. The decline was not just about ports and ships. It was a societal transformation. The old Norse ideals of the individual merchant warrior, his honor tied to his personal scales, were becoming obsolete. Success now belonged to the cartel, to the man who could work within the vast, bureaucratic machine of the Hanseatic League. The age of the independent operator was over. The Hanse did not conquer the Vikings with armies. They outmaneuvered them in the marketplace, offering a new model of commerce that was less romantic, less personal, but undeniably more powerful. They built a world where business was conducted not on a windswept beach through silent barter, but in a guild hall over a signed contract, marking the definitive end of one era and the beginning of another. But even the most brilliantly engineered trade network, built on ambition and adaptability, is not immune to the forces of nature. For the Norse settlements in Greenland, the changing climate wasn't a distant theory. It was a slowly tightening noose that strangled the very lifelines their survival depended upon. The phenomenon we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that began in the 13th century, didn't just make their world colder. It systematically dismantled the economic and logistical foundations of their society, transforming their once thriving outpost into a trapped and fading community. The most immediate and devastating impact was on the sea. The North Atlantic, always a treacherous highway, became an impassable barrier. The period saw a significant southward expansion of Arctic sea ice, particularly along the eastern coast of Greenland. The shipping routes from Iceland and Norway, already a weeks-long gamble, became a lethal lottery. The pack ice lingered longer into the summer months and advanced further south, creating a floating, shifting maze of bergs and ice floes that could trap, crush, and sink the strongest Knarr. A journey that was once a calculated risk for a merchant seeking profit became a near-suicidal mission. The number of ships making the crossing dwindled from a reliable trickle to a rare, celebrated event, and then eventually to nothing at all. For the Greenlanders, watching the horizon from their fjords, the absence of that sail on the water meant more than just loneliness. It meant they were being cut off from the essential imports their specialized economy could not produce. The silence of the empty sea was the sound of their isolation deepening. On land, the effects were equally cruel. The Little Ice Age brought shorter, cooler, and far more unpredictable growing seasons. The thin margin for agriculture in Greenland, always precarious, vanished entirely. The Norse relied on a brief window of summer to grow barley and hay to feed their livestock through the long, dark winter. As temperatures dropped, that windows slammed shut. Failed harvests became commonplace, and the winter fodder for their cherished sheep. The source of their valuable vath, mole wool, grew scarcer with each passing year. This nutritional stress affected the livestock themselves. Archaeological evidence from Greenlandic farm midden heaps shows the bones of Norse cattle and sheep becoming progressively smaller and weaker over generations, a direct result of malnutrition and the harsh conditions. The people in turn suffered. Their diet, already heavily reliant on dairy and livestock, became less diverse and less secure. The spectre of famine, once a remote threat, began to stalk the settlements. This environmental pressure also brought them into direct and violent competition with the one group that thrived in the colder climate: the Inuit, ancestors of the Thule culture, who were simultaneously expanding their territory southward. The Inuit were master adapters to the Arctic environment, with technologies far superior to the Norse for the new reality. Their sleek, skin-covered kayaks and umiaks were perfectly suited for navigating the ice-choked waters to hunt seals and whales, resources the Norse never effectively utilized. Their sophisticated toggle-headed harpoons were far more effective for hunting marine mammals than Norse spears or hooks. Where the Norse saw a frozen wasteland, the Inuit saw a land of plenty. The sagas and archaeological evidence both point to a relationship that soured from initial curious contact into outright hostility and conflict over dwindling resources, particularly the prized walrus hunting ground. The Norse, clinging to their European identity and pastoral ways, found themselves outcompeted in their own backyard by a culture perfectly evolved for the changing world. The ultimate tragedy of Norse Greenland is that its people were likely victims of their own success and specialization. For centuries, their economy was perfectly calibrated to a specific climatic niche, producing luxury goods for a distant market that paid handsomely. But that very specialization made them incredibly vulnerable. When the climate shifted and the market for their primary export collapsed due to the influx of elephant ivory, their entire reason for existing in that extreme environment evaporated. They were not incapable of adapting. They were incredibly resilient people, but the cost of a radical shift in subsistence to fully adopt the Inuit way of life may have been a cultural step too far. Their identity was tied to their livestock, their churches, and their connection to Europe. To abandon that was to cease being Norse. The last documented event from the settlement is a wedding recorded in the church at Valsey in 1408, a final glimpse of normalcy in a world that was closing in around them. After that, only silence remained, a stark lesson in how the most ingenious human systems can be undone by a changing climate that severs the connections we rely on most. For centuries, our understanding of Viking trade was pieced together from sagas, a handful of coins and scattered artifacts, a picture sketched in broad, often speculative strokes. But today, we are no longer relying on ancient texts alone. We are witnessing a quiet revolution, a paradigm shift in our knowledge driven not by the discovery of new hoards, but by the microscopic analysis of the soil they were buried in, the genetic secrets hidden inside mundane objects, and the precise calendar locked within the very wood of their ships. Modern archaeology, armed with a suite of powerful new scientific techniques, is systematically dismantling our old assumptions and revealing the Viking trade network in stunning, unprecedented detail, confirming connections we only dreamed of and revealing others we never imagined. Take, for instance, the seemingly empty soil of a former Viking Age market site. To the naked eye, it's just dirt, but to an archaeologist using soil geochemistry, that same soil is a detailed historical ledger. Every human activity leaves a unique chemical fingerprint. The area where livestock were penned will show elevated levels of phosphates, and nitrates from their waste. A blacksmith's forge will be surrounded by microscopic particles of iron and heavy metals. But for trade, the most telling signature is often the presence of specific trace elements associated with human waste and the decay of organic materials. By taking hundreds of core samples across a site like Ribe in Denmark or Birka in Sweden and mapping the chemical concentrations, researchers can now pinpoint the exact location of market stalls, workshops, and even different commercial districts without ever lifting a trowel. They can see how the use of space changed over centuries, watching as the fur trading quarter expanded or the metalworking district shifted. This isn't just guesswork. It's a high-resolution, data-driven map of economic activity, showing us the vibrant, smelly, bustling reality of these trading hubs in a way that traditional excavation alone never could. While soil chemistry maps the marketplace, DNA analysis is now tracing the journey of individual goods with forensic precision. Consider a simple-looking strip of woolen cloth found in a grave in Norway. For decades, we could only describe its weave and guess at its origin. Now we can sequence the DNA of the sheep that produced that wool. By comparing it to a growing database of genetic markers from sheep breeds across the North Atlantic, scientists can often pinpoint the very region, and sometimes even the specific island where the sheep was raised. A Viking buried in his homeland might be wrapped in a cloak spun from wool produced in the Irish Sea region. Similarly, analysis of animal hides and furs can distinguish between a beaver pelt from Sweden and one from Russia, tracing the specific fur trade routes that supplied a chieftain's grave. This technology even extends to artifacts like whalebone plaques. DNA can identify the species of whale, telling us if it was hunted in the North Atlantic or perhaps acquired through trade from even more distant Arctic waters. Each of these objects becomes a silent witness, its biological code revealing a personal story of production, transport, and exchange across vast distances. Perhaps the most dramatic advances have come from dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating. This isn't just about finding out when a tree was cut down. It's about building a hyper-accurate timeline and a map of human movement. European oak trees grow in a pattern of rings that is unique to each year, influenced by that specific year's climate conditions. Scientists have painstakingly assembled a master chronology for oak that stretches back thousands of years, a continuous fingerprint of time. When a Viking ship is discovered, like the 5 Skandinavian ships in Denmark, dendrochronologists can take core samples from its timbers, match the pattern of rings to the master chronology, and state with absolute certainty the exact year the tree was felled. But the revelations go even further. Because the master chronology also varies by region, the tree rings can often tell us where the oak tree grew. The results have been astounding. We now know that the great longship from Skandinavian was built from oak trees, cut down in the Dublin area around 1042, meaning it was constructed in Ireland, not Scandinavia. Another smaller merchant vessel was made from timber felled in the Viking homeland of Viking, Norway. This tells a story of a truly interconnected Norse world, where ships were built in Irish shipyards from local wood, perhaps by Norse settlers, and then sailed across the North Sea to serve in a Danish king's fleet. Dendrochronology transforms a silent shipwreck from a generic exhibit into a biographer with a precise passport and a known construction date. The convergence of these techniques is painting a picture of a trade network that was far more extensive, sophisticated, and resilient than we ever conceived. It confirms the sheer volume and reach of their commerce, proving that the sagas weren't mere exaggeration. Through isotope analysis of teeth, we can now trace the lifetime movement of an individual. A woman buried in a seemingly ordinary grave in England was found to have grown up in the mountains of Norway. her chemistry telling a story of migration that no grave good could ever reveal. Science is allowing us to see the network not as an abstract concept on a map, but as a living, breathing system of countless individual journeys, transactions, and connections, each one leaving a tiny, almost invisible trace that we are finally learning how to read. The Vikings may have left us few written records of their trade, but they left a billion microscopic clues in the objects they touched and the ground they walked on. And we are now, for the first time, listening to that story. Their commercial empire may have faded into history, but its foundations never truly vanished. They became the bedrock of modern Europe itself. The Viking trade routes did far more than move goods. They redrew the map, rewired the economy, and fundamentally reshaped the cultural and political landscape of the continent, leaving a legacy so profound we still live with its consequences today. Perhaps their most visible and enduring contribution lies in the very cities that now dot the map of Europe and beyond. Many of the vibrant urban centers we know today began not as royal capitals or religious sites, but as humble Viking trading posts, strategic knots in their vast commercial net. Take Dublin, for instance. What started as a simple long fort, a fortified ship camp on the River Liffey, quickly grew into a thriving slave and silver market, the cornerstone of the Norse kingdom of Dublin, and eventually the bustling capital of Ireland. In the east, the story is even more dramatic. The Rus Vikings established a series of forts along the Dnieper and Volga rivers to protect their trade places like Novgorod and Kiev. From these mercantile strongholds grew the powerful state of Kievan Rus, the direct predecessor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The name Russia itself is derived from these Viking traders. This urban revolution wasn't just about founding new cities. It was about introducing a whole new concept of economic space to Europe. The Vikings didn't just build towns, they built hubs, interconnected nodes in a network that prioritized access to waterways and trade routes over traditional defensible hills, forever altering the geography of power and commerce. Beyond the bricks and mortar of cities, the Vikings fundamentally altered the very palette of European desire, introducing a new set of luxury commodities that became staples of the medieval economy. Before the Viking Age, a European noble status was displayed through local treasures, Frankish weapons, perhaps, or fine glass. The Norse, however, flooded the market with exotic goods from the farthest edges of the known world, creating new cravings and new markets. The most significant of these was undoubtedly walrus ivory. For centuries, this fish tooth from the Arctic was the primary source of high-quality ivory in Europe, essential for crafting the most exquisite religious artifacts, chess sets, and jewelry for the elite. The Norse monopoly on this material made it a must-have status symbol, and its flow from Greenlandic hunting grounds to European cathedrals represented one of the longest sustained trade chains of the era. Similarly, the demand for specific northern furs, sable, black fox, and marten, was largely created and certainly dominated by Norse suppliers. These pelts became the ultimate luxury in both the scorching courts of the Islamic world and the drafty halls of European kings, a symbol of reach and sophistication. By connecting producers and consumers who would never otherwise have met, the Vikings didn't just satisfy existing demand. They actively manufactured new ones, setting trends that would define luxury for centuries, and proving the power of long-distance trade to shape culture and consumption. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, was the silent, slow integration of Scandinavia into the European mainstream. For centuries, the Norse had been the feared other, the pagan outsiders knocking at the gates of Christendom. Their trade routes became the very channels through which this otherness was dissolved. The constant, peaceful interaction in marketplaces from Hedeby to Constantinople facilitated an immense exchange of ideas, technology, and belief. Exposure to the wealth and organizational power of Christian kingdoms made a powerful impression on Norse chieftains. Converting to Christianity wasn't just a spiritual decision. It was a brilliant business and political strategy. Adopting the faith of your trading partners smoothed negotiations, secured alliances, and opened doors that would have remained closed to pagans. This process, repeated across generations, gradually eroded the old pagan worldview. The flow of ideas wasn't one way. European metalworking techniques, architectural styles, and artistic motifs traveled north on returning ships, while Norse legal concepts and seafaring technology filtered south. This cultural melting pot, stirred by commerce, eventually softened the distinct edges of Viking identity. The successful independent raider traders evolved into Christian kings who ruled unified, recognized European kingdoms like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Viking Age didn't end in military defeat. It ended because the Vikings, through their own networks of exchange, successfully joined the very world they had once raided, transforming from outsiders into insiders and forever weaving the Scandinavian thread into the rich tapestry of European civilization. Perhaps the most persistent myth of all is the image of the Viking trader as little more than a robber baron, a merchant who only knew how to trade at the point of a sword. While violence was certainly a tool in their arsenal, the overwhelming evidence reveals a reality far more nuanced and far more impressive. For every raid that captured headlines in monastic chronicles, there were 1,000 peaceful transactions conducted on a misty riverbank or in a bustling marketplace. Their success was not built on terror alone, but on a deep and sophisticated understanding of international economics, diplomacy, and the mechanics of trust. To view them as simple pirates is to miss the real story of how they built a network that required cooperation far more often than coercion. Consider the simple, powerful artifact of the scale. We find these finely balanced instruments in graves across the Norse world, buried with the same reverence as a warrior's sword. This was not the tool of a plunderer, but the essential instrument of a meticulous merchant. Their entire economy operated on a system of precise weights, often calibrated to an internationally recognized standard. A Norse trader in Novgorod could use his scales and his set of brass weights to trade seamlessly with an Arabic merchant, both confident in the fairness of the transaction. This system required an incredible level of trust and integrity. A merchant's reputation, his most valuable asset, was tied to the accuracy of his measurements. To be caught using false weights was a social and professional death sentence. This wasn't the behavior of haphazard raiders. It was the hallmark of a sophisticated commercial culture that understood its long-term success depended on reliability and fair dealing. Furthermore, the very geography of their trade routes speaks to careful planning, not random exploration. They didn't just point their ships west and hope for the best. They operated within a well-established and well-understood economic system. The location of their major trading hubs was a masterclass in strategic thinking. Hedeby was positioned at the narrowest overland crossing in Jutland, creating a vital shortcut that saved merchants weeks of dangerous sailing. Birka was placed to control access to the vast resources of the Swedish interior. These were not random settlements. They were the result of cold, calculated analysis of supply, demand, and logistics. They understood that to move fur from the Arctic to Baghdad, they needed secure stopping points, friendly ports for resupply, and safe passages. This required building relationships, not just burning monasteries. The treaties they signed are perhaps the most definitive proof of their peaceful mercantile intentions. The Rus Vikings didn't conquer Constantinople. They signed a formal commercial treaty with the Byzantine emperor. The text of this agreement, preserved in the primary chronicle, is a fascinating document. It meticulously outlines the rights and responsibilities of Norse traders within the city. How many men could enter at a time, what gates they could use, the tariffs they would pay, and the legal recourse they had in disputes. This is not the language of chaotic raiders. It is the language of serious, sophisticated merchants negotiating access to a coveted market. They were playing by the complex rules of international trade, and they were playing to win through commerce, not just conquest. Even their most fearsome reputation, that of the unstoppable raider, needs to be re-examined through an economic lens. A raid was often the riskier, more expensive option. It provoked immediate retaliation, hardened defenses, and made future peaceful trade in that region impossible. For a savvy chieftain, establishing a peaceful trading relationship was almost always more profitable in the long run. A raid yielded a one-time haul of treasure, but a trade agreement provided a continuous, renewable source of income. The choice between trading and raiding was often a simple cost-benefit analysis. If a coastal town was well defended, they would trade. If it appeared vulnerable, the same group might switch tactics. This wasn't mindless barbarism. It was a brutal form of pragmatism, a flexibility that allowed them to exploit every possible opportunity for profit. Their true genius lay in understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon in their arsenal wasn't the axe, but the silver on their scales. So as the sails of the Knarrs finally disappeared over the horizon of history, what were we left with? It's a legacy that stretches far beyond the realm of archaeology and into the very bones of our modern world. We began this journey with a simple question. What if the Viking story wasn't just one of raiders, but of the world's most ambitious merchants? And the answer we found is written across the globe. It's in the DNA of a Russian nation that takes its name from Viking traders, the Rus. It's in the street plan of Dublin, a city that began as a Viking slave market. It's in the words we speak, the urban networks we use, and the very idea of an interconnected North Atlantic. All concepts these Norse pioneers helped to forge. They were, without exaggeration, the first globalizers, the master weavers of a web that connected continents centuries before Columbus ever set sail. They built an economic engine so powerful, it could transform a walrus tusk, harvested by a hunter on the frigid coast of Greenland, into an exquisite chess piece for a nobleman in an English castle. They could take silver minted from ore deep in the mountains of Afghanistan and funnel it through river systems and across seas until it was buried in a farmer's field on the island of Gotland. They took timber from the endless forests of North America and moved it across an ocean to a treeless Greenland, where it was used to repair the very ships that would make the next dangerous journey. This wasn't random exploration. It was a highly sophisticated, decentralized, and resilient supply chain that moved luxury, necessity, and people across thousands of miles. Their true genius was an unparalleled adaptability. They could be brutal raiders one season and shrewd diplomats the next, signing complex trade treaties with the Byzantine emperor. They could be pagan shamans, invoking the old gods for a safe passage, and then sit down to a transaction using weights calibrated to an Islamic standard. They were at once fierce independents and master collaborators, building the towns and the trust that made such long-distance trade possible. They were the essential link between the pagan north and the Christian south, between the Islamic caliphates and the fledgling kingdoms of Europe. They didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, art, technology, and faith, acting as the lubricant for the cultural exchange that would eventually birth the Europe we recognize today. So I'll leave you with this final thought. The next time you see a map of the world, try to erase the political boundaries for a moment. Instead, picture it as the Vikings might have seen it, not as a collection of separate countries, but as a vast network of liquid highways and portage routes. A world of opportunity waiting to be connected by the courage of a crew and the hold of a ship. They saw the planet not as something to be conquered in the name of an empire, but as a marketplace to be explored. And that, perhaps, is their most surprising and enduring legacy. Now, I'm incredibly curious to hear from you. What aspect of this vast Viking commercial world did you find the most surprising? Was it the sheer geographical scope, the sophistication of their trade tools, the dark reality of the slave economy, or the fact that a Greenlandic walrus tusk could end up on a bishop's altar in Spain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's mysteries, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Thanks for watching.